All right. So now let's talk about Vietnam. All right. Vietnam, uh, at the beginning of the war in Vietnam, pretty much everybody in the United States was for it because Americans still thought about, their role in the world as being the bastion of liberty, the protector of democracy in the world, right? And the war in Vietnam had come to be defined by Americans as a war against communism. Now, in the documents that you guys are reading, you will realize that from the point of view of people who lived in Vietnam, it really wasn't about communism, or for many of it wasn't about communism. It was about land reform and colonialism, right? But nevertheless, Americans believed it was about communism. And so Americans were very much in favor of intervening in Vietnam. But after a couple of years, people come to realize that what they're doing in Vietnam isn't defending democracy, that what they're doing in Vietnam is actually waging war against poor farmers, essentially, right? And particularly because there's a draft, which means that if you're over 18, the possibility that you could be called up to go and fight in this war in Vietnam is very real. Many young people in the country are going to be very much against the war in Vietnam. Many young people in the country are going to believe that the war in Vietnam is an unjust war. The United States shouldn't be involved in it, and I in particular don't want to be involved in it, right? And this was true. I mean, if you think of, you have to imagine, right? What if when you guys graduated from high school, which for many of you wasn't very long ago, right? The first the possibility that you were faced with was that you would have to go, you would be drafted into the army, and you would have to go to Afghanistan and serve in Afghanistan for a couple of years before you could go on with your life. You follow what I'm saying? You have to imagine, how would you feel about that, right? And there's a range of feelings, obviously, as you guys were reading about in your documents. For the most part, young people were like, I don't want that decision made for me, particularly when I don't agree with the war at all. All right. And so what happens then is that there develops what's known as a generation gap, right? The generation gap is between the young people against the war and the older people, the World War II generation, who are in favor of the war. And they're saying, look, we did our part during World War II to go and defend liberty in the world. Now it's your turn. And the kids are saying, no, we don't want to go over there. That's not our war. It doesn't have nothing to do with us. It's not about the same thing. And so the older generation looks at the younger generation as a bunch of almost like traitors, right? They're weak, soft, pinkos, right? And the long hair and hippies and all that stuff. The kind of rebellion of youth, and keep in mind that this is the baby boom generation, right? So at one point there were actually more people in the country younger than 15 than there were older than 15. Okay, and so this is a big divide, and the people start to look at the old people as enemies, and the old people start to look at the young people as enemies, right? There were places in the South, for example, where hippies who would travel around Volkswagen buses, right, would drive through a town somewhere in Mississippi or something like that, and it would be in the newspaper that there was a busload of hippies that had gone through town last week, right? Like they were a different species or something. You know what I'm saying? And so, at any rate, this is another area where there's a division between young and old. Okay. And then the way that the war in Vietnam actually was fought, because of the draft, the way that the draft worked was that if you were enrolled in college, you wouldn't be drafted. You would get a different, okay? And so it was, as long as you get into college, then you wouldn't have to worry about being drafted. You see what I'm saying? But you have to be in college, all right? Once you got into college, then you never have to worry about, you wouldn't have to be worried about being drafted. And if you like would stay in college for 3 years uh, as an English major, and then after 3 years declare your major to be biology, then you have to basically start all over again, right? You could stay in college for decades, right? So and many people did. Okay, so what that left was that the people who couldn't afford college were the ones who were called up at a greater rate. So and those people, the poorer people, to be minorities. All right. So it's not, they were not all minorities. There were a lot of poor white people too, right? But what ended up happening was that the demographics of the people who fought in the war in Vietnam were didn't represent the demographics of the United States, because the demographics in Vietnam were a majority of minorities and a minority of whites. You guys get what I'm saying? So this becomes an issue of class and also an issue of race. Okay, so you guys could see in the video where they were talking about the black people. It was people from Detroit that would end up going to Vietnam, right? And people from the suburbs that would end up going to college. And so it becomes not just an issue of poor versus rich, but also an issue of black versus white, or minority versus majority. You guys follow what I'm saying here? All right, so this is another division in American society. So when we get to the end of the 1960s, by the time we get to 1968, the United States is essentially tearing itself apart internally. And I think hopefully when you guys watched that video, you were able to kind of get a feeling for the divisions in the United States at the time.